Good evening, good Vach Shavua Tov, a good week to you, my lovely sisters and brothers. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? Joe in the Inland Empire, Karen in Northern California, Bella in Florida, Chaim in Florida, Lester in Florida, Ella in Southern California, Moishi in Brooklyn, and Franco, usually checking in from Trieste, Italy, now checking in from Turkana, Kenya. Wow. Enjoy your travels. May it be fruitful and fascinating. Also, Abelbito in Panama and Debbie in New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. Our daf tonight is page 106 here in Tractate Zevachim. We're not too far away from a siyum on this tractate, about 2 weeks. I think it's 120 pages. And tonight, with God's help, we're going to complete chapter 12 and open chapter 13. Right now, we are finishing up our discussion of Mishna 4, right? Mishna 4 here in chapter 12. Yeah, Mishna 4 in chapter 12. And we're near the bottom. 3/4 of the way down, page 105b. The Mishnah teaches when both these and those priests emerge, right? So we're talking about the bulls and goats that are burned, meaning the inner offerings, inner sin offerings, whether it's the bull or goat of Yom Kippur or the bulls and goats of the mistaken rulings of the Sanhedrin or a mistake of the high priest, and then or mistaken ruling of the Sanhedrin, and the population relied on it, came to violate halacha because they were relying on the Sanhedrin, or even to commit idolatry because of that reliance. Special offerings that are slaughtered in the north, of course, of the courtyard, then their blood sprinkled inside the sanctuary on the parochis, the curtain that separates between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies, and also on the golden altar, or the incense altar, as it is called. Those offerings, right, none of it is eaten and none of it is burned on the mizbeach, on the altar. Rather, they are taken outside, as we've learned, not only outside the Holy Temple, not only outside the Temple Mount, but outside of Jerusalem entirely, taken to a special place, and they are burned there. And the Torah specifies about them that the person who takes them out there to be burned will become tameh in that process, ritually impure. They must immerse themselves and their garments, and then they'll be purified and can return to the temple. And yesterday we were talking about, exactly when do they become tameh, if they're carrying the animal out on a pole, after it's been slaughtered and the blood sprinkled. And there's a guy at the front and a guy in the back. If they only get the animal halfway out, are both of them tameh or not? Okay, continuing that discussion. So when both these priests and those priests emerged, all of their garments were rendered tameh. And the Gemara explains from where are these matters derived. As the sages taught in a baraisa, the verse states with regard to the bull and the goat that are burned on Yom Kippur, they shall be carried forth outside the camp. That's Leviticus 16:27. There, elsewhere, the verse states that such bulls and goats are burned outside 3 camps, right? 3 camps because we're making an analogizing equivalency between the three camps in the wilderness when the Jews came out of Egypt, and you had all the people in their array by tribes. That's the sort of outer camp, the general camp of the children of Israel. And then in the center of that was the Levite camp, and at the center of that was the Mishkan, the Tabernacle. And so once the temple was built, we say that the center, of course, is the Holy Temple. And then the Levite camp is analogous to the Temple Mount. And then the camp of the children of Israel is analogous to the city of Jerusalem. To be outside of the entire encampment is understood, therefore, to be outside of three camps, right? Outside the center camp of the Holy Temple, outside the sort of middle camp of the Temple Mount, and outside the third camp, the largest camp, which would encompass the city of Jerusalem, and again, analogous to the Tabernacle, the Levite camp, and the camp of the children of Israel. So, there it says that such bulls and goats are burned outside three camps. Those of the Tabernacle, the Levites, and the Israelites. Whereas here, the verse states only that they are taken outside one camp, i.e. outside the tabernacle. And this serves to tell you that once the offering emerges beyond one camp, either the tabernacle in the wilderness or the holy temple once it was built in Jerusalem, then one who carries it renders his garments tameh, as the next verse states, and he who burns them shall wash his garments in Leviticus 16:28. So the Gemara explains further, and from where do we derive that law itself, that the bulls and goats are burned outside the three camps? How do we know that? As the sages taught in a baraisa, it is stated about the bull brought as a sin offering of the high priest when he makes a mistake, or the sin offering of the high priest on Yom Kippur, even the whole bull shall he carry outside the camp into a pure place where the ashes are poured out and burn it. That's Leviticus 4:12, meaning that he should take it outside three camps. Now, do you say that he takes it outside the three camps? Maybe he's only required to take it outside of one camp. Where do you get three camps? When the verse states with regard to the bull brought as a communal sin offering, he shall carry the bull outside the camp and burn it as he burned the first bull. So it requires explanation, as there is no need for the verse to state outside the camp, since it already stated at the end of the same verse, and burn it as he burned the first bull, which indicates that all the halachas of the bull brought as a sin offering of a high priest apply to the bull brought as a communal sin offering. What then does the verse mean when it states outside the camp? To give it a second camp, i.e. it indicates that it must be removed not only from the camp of the divine presence, corresponding to the temple or the tabernacle in the wilderness, but also from the Levite camp, which corresponds to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And when another verse states with regard to the removal of the ash, quote, and he shall put off his garments and put on other garments and carry forth the ashes outside the camp to a pure place, Leviticus 6:4, that verse also requires an explanation, as there is no need for the verse to state this, since it already stated with regard to the bull brought as a sin offering of the high priest, even the whole bull shall he carry outside the camp to a pure place, where the ashes are poured out, and burn it on the wood with fire. Where the ashes are poured out, shall it be burned. So the repetition of outside the camp indicates that he is required to give it a third camp, i.e. teaching that it is burned when outside the Israelite camp, and this corresponds to the land outside the walls of Jerusalem once the temple is built. So the Gemara asks, and what does Rabbi Shimon do with this phrase stated with regard to the bull and goat of Yom Kippur outside the camp, as written in Leviticus 16:27? Given that he holds that the garments do not become impure until the offering is actually burning. So the Gemara answers, he requires it for that which is taught in a baraisa. Rabbi Eliezer says, it is stated here outside the camp, and it is stated there with regard to the red heifer, right, whose ashes are needed for the water of sprinkling for purification. He shall bring it outside the camp. That's Numbers 19:3. So, just as here, the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur are burned outside three camps, so too, there, the red heifer is burned outside three camps. And just as there, the red heifer is burned east of Jerusalem, since it must be burned toward the front of the tent of meeting, Numbers 19:4, opposite the entrance of the temple, which is to its east, so too, here, the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur are burned east of Jerusalem. And we've seen an illustration of that. It's a nice picture they have in the Koran elsewhere, that when they burn the red heifer, right, there were 9 in Jewish history, an absolutely red cow, not a single hair on that cow that is not of that rust red color. And so it would be slaughtered on this place where? On the Mount of Olives, on a special platform that they erected for that purpose, and a long bridge, right, that they would then, I think, use it to walk the cow out from the Holy Temple and bring the ashes back. But it was outside the Temple Mount. If you've been to Israel, right, and you've seen, maybe, most Jews have not been on the Temple Mount. Some have. But a lot of us have visited the Mount of Olives, right, from which you have a beautiful view of the Temple Mount. And you could see, where the temple stood. And you would, if you're standing there, you'd be facing the front of the temple. And so that's where they burned the red heifer. And since it's outside the walls of Old Jerusalem, you are outside of Jerusalem. Which is to the east. And therefore, so too here, the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur are burned east of Jerusalem. Now we're on page 106a. But according to the rabbis, then, where outside Jerusalem do they burn them? Since this was the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. So the Gemara responds, as it is taught in Baraisa, where are the bulls and goats burned? They are burned north of Jerusalem, outside of the 3 camps. So Rabbi Yosef HaGalili says they are burned on the place of the ashes, where the ashes from the altar were poured, right? Every day they had to remove the previous day's ashes from the altar for all the, the pyre, the wood that was burned there, and the various offerings that were burned on the altar the previous day. Those ashes are removed every day. Where are they left, right? So they're put in this place outside. Rava said, who is the Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Yosef HaGalili? It is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. As it is taught in Baraisa, the verse states with regard to the bulls that are burned, where the ashes are poured out, shefech hadeshin, shall it be burned, in Leviticus 4:12. So this teaches that ashes must be there already when the bulls are burned. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says the verse teaches that its place should slope, meshupach, downward, so that ashes from the burning will slide downhill. And Abaye said to Rava, perhaps they disagree only about whether the place must slope, but Eliezer ben Yaakov agrees that it must be the place where the ashes from the altar were deposited, right? That these bulls that are burned, where are they burned? In the same place where the ashes are deposited every day when they're taken off the altar, taken outside the Temple Mount, and outside the city of Jerusalem. The sages taught in a Baraisa, the verse states with regard to the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur, and he who burns them shall wash his garments. And this teaches that only the one who burns them renders his garments tameh, impure. But the one who kindles the fire, doesn't come into contact with the animal, does not render the garments, his garments impure. And the one who sets up the arrangement of wood does not render his garments impure, although they're involved in the process of the burning of those goats and bulls that are burned. They never come into contact with the animal, and so they are not rendered impure according to this. And who is considered the one who burns? The one who actually assists at the actual time of burning. So one might have thought that this priest renders his garments impure even after the bull and the goat become ash. Therefore, the verse states, and he who burns them, teaching that they, the whole bull and goat, render garments impure, but they do not render garments impure once they have become ash. And Rabbi Shimon says the word them teaches that they render garments impure, but once the flesh is incinerated, they do not render garments impure. My Benehu, what is the difference between these two opinions, incinerated and become ash? So Rava said the difference between them is when he turned it into a charred mass. And the form of the animal has become distorted, but has not actually become ash. So the first Tana holds that at this stage the offering still transmits Tuma, whereas Rabbi Shimon holds that it does not. Right? If it's a charred, burned, former carcass, even though it has not fully become ash, according to Rabbi Shimon, it no longer imparts tuma, but according to the other opinion, it does. And with that, we conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 4 and chapter 12. We move on to chapter 13. Here we're going to be discussing the law, basically, that once the tabernacle was built and its altar with it, later when the temple was built, God commanded that not only, it's obviously a big prohibition, major prohibition, that you can't bring offerings to other gods, that's idolatry. But not only that, you can't even bring offerings to God outside the structure that God commanded, i.e., on the altar in the Holy Temple. That's where you bring offerings. As we've discussed a few times, there were brief periods in history where private altars were possible for bringing individual offerings, not communal offerings. But those were brief periods. And other than in those periods, if a person was going to bring an offering, he had to bring it, right, either to the tabernacle, which was in the wilderness for 40 years, and then it was in a few different locations in the land of Israel, including Shiloh, Nov, and Gibeon. And later, when the temple was built, you could only bring them at the temple, and they would be offered by the priests on the altar, right? So bringing offerings outside of those locations, not permitted. And what does bring offerings mean? Number one, you couldn't slaughter offerings in order to bring them outside of that location. And number two, you couldn't, put them on some kind of an altar and burn them to God outside of the given locations. And those are two separate prohibitions, as we shall see. Okay, Mishnah number 1 of chapter 13, still on page 106a. One who slaughters an offering outside the temple courtyard, and one who offers it up outside the temple courtyard is liable for the slaughter and liable for the offering up, as each act involves an independent prohibition. If done intentionally, he is liable to receive excision from the world to come, which is known as kares, for each act, and if done unwittingly, he is liable to bring a sin offering for each act. And we've seen elsewhere that the sages disagree about exactly what kares means. Does it mean that you're going to lose, your place entirely in the world to come? Does it mean that your life will be shortened? Does it mean that a person will die without children? They argue. There's a lot of different things, but at any rate, it's not good. Right? It is not good. It's basically usually called death at the hands of heaven, whatever that means. Rabbi Yosei HaGalili says if he slaughtered an offering inside the courtyard, so he slaughtered it in a proper place, but then he offered it up outside the courtyard, he is liable for offering up outside the courtyard. But if he slaughtered it outside, thereby rendering it unfit, and then he offered it up outside, he is exempt for the offering up, as he offered up only an item that is unfit, and one is liable only for offering up an item that is fit to be offered up inside the temple. Right? What he's saying is, let's say you decided to offer a cat as a sacrifice to Hashem. So you're not liable for violating this prohibition, because cats are not valid offerings. Cats are never brought as offerings in the Holy Temple. So this thing that you did, it was nonsense, right? You just did nonsense. So what he's saying is, and likewise, if you slaughter an animal outside the Holy Temple, okay, you shouldn't have done that, but since you slaughtered outside the temple, it's not fit to be brought as an offering inside the temple. So why would you then be liable for the offering up outside the temple? The thing that you offered up is as unfit as a cat. That is Rabbi Yosei Galili's opinion, but he's going to be overruled by the rabbis. The rabbis said to him, according to your reasoning, even in a case where he slaughters it inside and offers it up outside, he should be exempt for offering it up outside, since the moment that he took it outside the courtyard, he thereby rendered it unfit. Once it was taken outside the courtyard, it can't be brought back inside the courtyard and offered up on the altar. And yet, in such a case, he is certainly liable for offering it up. So too, one who slaughters an offering, as long as it's a kosher animal fit for slaughter, outside the temple, and then offers it up outside is liable for violating two prohibitions, slaughtering and offering up, both outside the temple. Now, one who is tameh, ritually impure, and who ate sacrificial food, whether it was tameh sacrificial food or tahor sacrificial food, either ritually impure or ritually pure sacrificial food, is liable to receive kares if he did so intentionally, and to bring a sliding scale offering if he did so unwittingly. A person who is tameh cannot eat the food of sacrificial offerings, cannot eat the edible parts of sacrificial offerings if he is tameh. And according to this, even if the food itself had become tameh. Rabbi Yosei HaGalili says a tameh person who ate tahor sacrificial food is liable. But a tameh person who ate tameh sacrificial food is exempt, as he merely ate a tameh item. It's no longer sacrificial food once it becomes tameh. And the prohibition against eating sacrificial food while one is himself tameh applies only to sacrificial food that is tahor, that is pure. The rabbi said to him, according to your logic, the law would apply even in a case of an impure person who ate what had been pure sacrificial food, because once he touched it, he thereby rendered it tameh. Yet, in such a case, he is certainly liable for eating it, and so too, a tameh person who ate tameh food is liable, as long as it's sacrificial food. And a pure person who ate tameh food, he is exempt, as one is liable for eating tameh food. One is liable for eating sacrificial food in tuma only due to the tuma of himself, his body, not the tuma of the food, right? So if food had become tameh and you ate it, sacrificial food had become tameh, it shouldn't be eaten, but if you ate it, you're not going to be liable for violating this prohibition and subject to kares. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that if one both slaughters and offers up an offering outside the temple courtyard, he is liable for each act, as they are independent prohibitions. And the Gemara asks, okay, granted that one is liable for the offering up, as the punishment for this act is written in the Torah, and the prohibition concerning this act is also written in the Torah. Okay, so when we're talking about prohibitions in the Torah that have heavy penalties, so you're only going to receive that penalty if both things are written in the Torah, that the act is prohibited and that there is a penalty for it, right? So sometimes it's written that if you do such a thing, this is the penalty. Now, in that verse, it's obvious that that thing is prohibited because if you do it, there's a penalty. But the Torah did not explicitly state it's prohibited, right? And so you would not receive the penalty according to this argument. Now, that's certainly true in the case of an earthly court, right? For an earthly court to administer lashes or a death penalty, the Torah has to state in separate verses that the act is prohibited and that you will receive lashes or that you will receive a death penalty. Both the prohibition and the penalty have to be stated. So what they're saying here is, okay, with regard to offering up outside the holy temple, the Torah states the prohibition and the penalty. But what it's going to say is, but for slaughtering, does it state both the prohibition and the penalty? So let's keep reading. So granted that one is liable for offering up, as the punishment for this act is written in the Torah, and the prohibition concerning this act is also written in the Torah. The punishment is as it is written. Any man that offers up a burnt offering or sacrifice and will not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to sacrifice it to the Lord, and that man shall be cut off from his people. That's the punishment, right? The penalty. The prohibition is as it is written, take heed to yourself, lest you offer up your burnt offerings in every place that you see, right? Meaning you can't do it wherever you want. You're going to have to follow the rules. And this is in accordance with that which Rabbi Avin says, that Rabbi Elazar says, wherever it is stated in the Torah, observe or lest or do not, it is nothing other than a prohibition. Accordingly, the verse in Deuteronomy is understood as issuing a prohibition. But for the slaughtering, why is one liable? granted that the punishment is stated in the Torah. As it is written, any man that slaughters it outside the camp, and he did not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to sacrifice an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, that man shall be cut off from among his people. That's the penalty. Where's the prohibition? But from where do we derive its prohibition? One is liable only in a case where the Torah specifies both the prohibition and the punishment. The Gemara answers, the verse states in the continuation of that passage, and they shall not slaughter any more their offerings to the Seirim, after whom they go astray. Right? So here they don't translate the word Seirim. We're going to keep reading. The Gemara questions the use of this verse as a source. But this verse is necessary for the purpose of expounding in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Elazar. As he says, from where is it derived with regard to one who slaughters an animal as an offering to a pagan deity, in this case Mercury, that he is liable even though this is not the established manner in which the deity is worshipped, right? So let's say that the pagans worship Mercury by, dropping arrows in a bucket. That's how you worship Mercury. And then this Jew comes along and sacrifices an offering to Mercury. Okay, well, that's not the way Mercury is worshipped. The people who worship Mercury toss arrows in the bucket. He brought an offering. Is he liable? Yes. And that's according to this statement of Rabbi Elazar. As it is written, and they shall not slaughter any more their offerings to the Seirim. So if the verse is not needed to teach the matter of worshiping a deity in accordance with its established matter, as it is already taught that one is liable for this, as it is written, take heed to yourself lest you inquire after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? So too will I do likewise. Then applied to the matter of worshiping a deity in a way that is not in accordance with its established manner. Right? So that verse is needed to teach us that whether you worship some idol according to the way those idolaters worship that idol or according to some way that you make up, either way, if you're a Jew, you have violated the prohibition on idolatry. Therefore, it's not free to say that you can't worship God by slaughtering outside the holy temple. It's not free to teach us that, so how do we learn the prohibition? Rabbah said, both laws can be derived from the same verse. Read into the verse as though it stops after the phrase, and they shall not slaughter. And it relates to the prohibition against slaughtering outside the temple courtyard, which was mentioned in the previous verses. And also read into the verses relating to the verse's continuation, and not anymore their offerings to the Seirim, which serves as the source for the prohibition against sacrificing offerings to false deities, no matter how you do it. And the Gemara challenges this analysis and says, but the verse is still necessary for the purpose of expounding that which is taught in a different place, in a baraisa. The verse states, any man that slaughters outside the camp, and he did not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to sacrifice an offering to the Lord. So that's Leviticus 17, verses 3 and 4. Until this point, the verse is speaking about sacrificial animals that one consecrated during a period when the prohibition against sacrificing on private altars was in effect, after the tabernacle was erected. And then he also sacrificed them during a period when the prohibition against sacrificing on private altars was in effect. Right, so what they're going to make, this gets very tough to follow. I had trouble earlier when I was reading it. The concept here is, as I told you, there were periods when, even after the tabernacle was erected, like shortly after the people came into the land of Israel, where private altars were permitted for individual offerings. Now, once that happened, you had a very, very technical question which became possible, a technical situation where that became possible, where you consecrated an animal before the prohibition on private altars lapsed, right? While it was still prohibited to sacrifice an animal on a private altar, that's when you consecrated the animal. Then it became permitted to sacrifice on private altars. So if you consecrated your animal at the time when you would have needed to bring it to the tabernacle and the national altar to sacrifice it, and then it became permitted to sacrifice on individual altars, can you bring this animal that you consecrated when that wasn't permitted to the private altar? Right? And then vice versa. If you consecrated it when it was permitted on private altars, and then private altars became prohibited, and then you brought that animal to the holy temple, is there a problem with that? Right? So there's going to be a whole host of questions based on, when that law was enacted and when you consecrated and where you consecrated and when you slaughtered and where you slaughtered. And so we'll try to keep it straight. Right? So until this point, the verse is speaking about sacrificial animals that one consecrated during the period when the prohibition against sacrificing on private altars was in effect. Right? So that they have the tabernacle, people can only sacrifice at the tabernacle. And then he also sacrificed them during a period when the prohibition against sacrificing on private altars was in effect. So presumably, if he sacrificed it in the holy temple, there's no question. But he sacrificed it outside the tabernacle on a private altar. That's not permitted, right? Since we're learning that the prohibition is in effect. Now we're on 106b, right? So this is apparent as the punishment for sacrificing them is stated in the verse, and he did not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to sacrifice an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord. That man shall be cut off, that's charis, from among his people. So the prohibition is also explicit, as it is written, take heed to yourself, lest you offer up your burnt offerings in every place that you see. That's offering up. We know that offering up is both explicitly prohibited and punished. From that point onward, the verse, according to this reading, is speaking about sacrificial animals that one consecrated during a period when there was permission to sacrifice offerings on private altars. Okay, consecrated when it was permitted to bring it on a private altar, i.e. before the tabernacle was erected. Okay, so now not when they entered the land of Israel, but before the tabernacle was erected. So it's like before the Torah was given, right? I mean, we saw that, in the Torah, we've been reading it, right, in our trip through the book of Genesis, that Abraham brought offerings, Isaac brought offerings, Jacob brought offerings, right? They brought offerings many times. Where did they bring them? Obviously on private altars, because there was no national altar. The tabernacle wasn't erected. The Torah hadn't been given. There was no national altar. So that was still a tradition. Maybe while the Jews were in Egypt, hopefully they were still bringing offerings on private altars because they were worshiping God. And bringing sacrifices was the way people generally worship God in those days. When they came out of Egypt, maybe they were filled with thanks. Right now, they brought the Pesach because God instructed them to do that. Moses taught them how to bring the Pesach, the Passover lamb or goat. Well, I think it was a lamb the first year when they were still in Egypt. And that was on the night before they left. Okay, then they left with great signs and wonders. And then Pharaoh and all his chariots were drowned in the Sea of Reeds. Now, there was some time, a matter of weeks, between leaving Egypt, seeing their oppressors drowned in the sea, and the Torah being given at Mount Sinai. Maybe they were filled with gratitude and wanted to bring an offering. They could do that at that time. I don't know if they did. Maybe Moses told them not to, but they had not been instructed by the Torah because the Torah wasn't given yet. So maybe they consecrated an animal thinking, I'm going to bring this up on a private altar. And maybe he hadn't done it yet when the Torah was given. So this animal that was consecrated with the intention of bringing it on a private altar, could it be brought now on the national altar? Let's keep reading. So from that point on in the verse, it's speaking about sacrificial animals that were consecrated during a period when there was permission to sacrifice offerings on private altars, i.e. before the tabernacle was erected. And then he sacrificed them outside the tabernacle during a period when the prohibition against sacrificing on private altars was in effect. Meaning he consecrated it before the tabernacle was erected, intending to bring it on a private altar. Then the tabernacle was erected. So now we have the tabernacle. So he has the possibility of bringing it on the national altar. but he brought it outside the tabernacle anyway, right? So did he violate this prohibition? Sounds like yes, he violated. Even though when he consecrated, there was no national altar, by the time he was bringing the offering, there was one, and he should have brought on the national altar, and he didn't. And they're saying that the Torah prohibits that. Now, this is apparent, as it is stated, in order that the children of Israel shall bring their sacrifices, which they slaughter upon the open field, that they shall bring them to the Lord to the entrance of the tent of meeting. Open field, right? Once the tabernacle is built, you would never sacrifice something in the open field. You would never slaughter in the open field, right? Which they slaughter upon the open field. Why would you even mention in the Torah slaughtering in the open field when we know it's only permitted to slaughter them in the temple courtyard or in the courtyard of the tabernacle before the temple is built? That's why the sages are saying, it must be that they're talking about at the inception of the construction of the tabernacle, some animals had already been slaughtered outside. Okay, but now you have to bring them in and offer them up on the national altar. And if you don't, you're going to be violating the prohibition of offering up animals on private altars. The phrase, their sacrifices which they slaughter, is interpreted as referring to offerings that I have previously permitted for you to slaughter on private altars. This verse teaches that those offerings may now be sacrificed only inside the tabernacle. And the phrase upon the open field tells you that in the case of one who slaughters an offering on a private altar during a period when the prohibition against sacrificing on private altars is in effect, even if he sacrifices the offering to God, the verse ascribes to him blame as if he sacrificed it upon the open field in idolatrous worship. Right? Once we had a structure for the national worship involving sacrifices, tabernacle, altar, later the holy temple and its altar, sacrifices even to God can only be brought there. And if you don't, it's like idolatry. So the verse continues, that they shall bring them to the Lord. This is a positive mitzvah, right? Thou shalt, as opposed to a negative prohibition, thou shalt not. This is a positive mitzvah, to sacrifice in the tabernacle, even offerings that were consecrated before the tabernacle was erected. From where is it derived that there is a prohibition against sacrificing them outside the tabernacle? The verse states, and they shall not slaughter any more their offerings to the Seirim, after whom they go astray. This shall be to them an eternal statute throughout their generations. So one might have thought that sacrificing these offerings outside the tabernacle would be punishable by Karas, as is the law with regard to offerings consecrated after the tabernacle was erected. Therefore, the verse states, this shall be to them an eternal statute throughout their generations. And one can infer from this verse that this, the punishment for transgressing a positive mitzvah and a prohibition, applies to them, but no other punishment applies to them. Meaning, it is clear from this baraisa that the verse, and they shall not slaughter any more, is used to teach about the prohibition against sacrificing outside the tabernacle, those offerings that were consecrated while there was permission to sacrifice on private altars, and not those offerings that were consecrated while it was prohibited to sacrifice on private altars. Meaning, right, it's a different prohibition. Now, obviously, we already know that once the tabernacle is up and you're not permitted to do anything on private altars, that if you consecrate, in order to, you can consecrate outside the holy temple, but you can't slaughter. If you slaughter outside the temple and if you bring up outside the temple, you violated two prohibitions. But what it's saying is it's not talking about animals that were consecrated after the prohibition on private altars went into effect, I guess because that's covered by a different verse, not because it's permitted to bring those up anywhere outside the holy temple. Okay. Rather, Rabbi Avin says, the prohibition against slaughtering an offering outside the temple is derived in a whole different manner. He's going to derive it, right? Because remember, we had a punishment for slaughtering outside the temple, but we're still looking for the prohibition. Where is that written in the Torah? So Rabbi Avin says the way it's written in the Torah is that you have to derive it through a kal v'chomer inference. Where? It's derived through a kal v'chomer inference like this. Just as in a case in which the Torah did not prescribe punishment for a certain action, it nevertheless prohibited, as is the case with regard to sacrificing outside the temple, an offering that was consecrated while there was permission to sacrifice on private altars, so too in a case in which the Torah did prescribe punishment for a certain action, as is the case with regard to slaughtering outside the temple, an offering consecrated while it was prohibited to sacrifice on private altars, is it not logical that the Torah prohibited the action? Right? All the more so, it must be prohibited. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, there's a problem with your logic. If so, that whenever the Torah states a punishment for a certain action, there is no need to state the prohibition, then let the Torah not state a prohibition with regard to eating forbidden fat of a kosher animal. And then we could derive the fact that it is prohibited through a kal v'chomer inference from the prohibition against eating a nevela, right? An animal carcass that was not slaughtered in a kosher manner. Just as with regard to a nevela, even though the Torah did not prescribe punishment for consuming it, it is nevertheless prohibited, right? The Torah specifically said you may not eat it. So too, with regard to animal fat, for which the Torah did prescribe punishment, is it not logical that the Torah prohibited its consumption? Rav Ashi came before Rava and said to him, the prohibition against eating animal fat can also not be derived from the prohibition of a nevela, as the kal v'chomer inference can be refuted as follows. What is notable about a nevela? It is notable in that it renders other items tameh, ritually impure, through contact with it. Forbidden fat, which we're not allowed to eat, does not share this stringency. It does not impart tuma. The existence of a unique stringency undermines the possibility of using a kal v'chomer inference. Rav Ashi raises the possibility of deriving the prohibition against eating forbidden fat through a kal v'chomer inference from various other prohibitions that, like forbidden fat, do not carry the stringency of being punishable by kares, and that's how Rava rejects each one. Can one derive the prohibition against eating forbidden fat from the prohibition against eating carcasses of ritually impure creeping animals? One cannot. As what is notable about a ritually impure creeping animal, a sheretz, right? So it's for example, a skink or a mouse that is dead. If you touch it, you become tameh. They are notable in that they render other items tameh through contact with any amount of them. Forbidden fat does not share that stringency. Can one derive it from the prohibition against eating the nevela from eating a sheretz? I'm sorry, no. Can one derive it from the prohibition against eating the carcasses of ritually pure creeping animals? Ritually pure creeping animals, right? So the actual little things, little critters, lizards, rodents, doesn't include all rodents and lizards, right? It's only some of them that are in the category of sheretz that if you touch them, you will become tameh. I believe, for example, I could be wrong, but I believe like a worm is not a sheretz, you know? So if there was a dead worm and you touched it, you don't become tameh. You can't eat it, but you don't become tameh. All right? So can one derive from the prohibition against eating the carcasses of ritually pure creeping animals, which do not have the capacity to render other items tameh? One cannot, as what is notable about ritually pure creeping animals. They are notable in that, with regard to their prohibition, there is liability for consuming any amount of them. Forbidden fat does not share that stringency. Can one derive it from the prohibition against eating the fruit of a tree during its first 3 years of planting? Orla, right? Fruit trees, when you plant them, the first 3 years, they might generate fruit, but you cannot eat that fruit. Until the 4th year, when the temple is standing, then you would bring bikurim, and then thereafter you could eat the fruit of that tree. So that prohibition is known as orla, or the prohibition of planting diverse kinds in a vineyard. Like you can't plant wheat in a vineyard, because God said so. That's called kilayim. So can one derive it from the prohibitions of orla or kilayim, for which one is liable only if he eats a minimum volume, the olive bulk, just like with regard to animal fat. One cannot, as what is notable about orla and kilayim. They are notable in that they are items from which deriving benefit is prohibited. Forbidden fat does not share this stringency. You can't eat it, but you could sell it. Can one derive it from the prohibition against eating sabbatical year produce, from which benefit is permitted, just like with regard to animal fat? Nope. What is notable about sabbatical year produce? It is notable in that it transfers its sanctity to the money with which it is purchased. Forbidden fat does not share that stringency. Can one derive it from the prohibition of a non-priest partaking of the portion of produce that is designated for the priest? Teruma, right? Can a non-priest eat teruma? One cannot. As in the case of teruma, there are no circumstances in which its general prohibition was permitted. The prohibition concerning teruma applies broadly, unlike in the case of forbidden fat, where the prohibition applies only to the fat of domesticated animals, but not to the fat of undomesticated kosher animals. Rava notes that the possibility of deriving the prohibition against eating forbidden fat from all of those prohibitions can also be refuted based on this claim, as in those cases too, there are no circumstances in which their general prohibition became permitted. Rava said, if there is a difficulty for me in accepting Rabbi Avin's claim that the prohibition against slaughtering an offering outside the temple can be derived via kol vachomer inference, this is the difficulty for me. That which we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Karisos, first Mishnah there, page 2a, which enumerates the 36 cases for which one is liable to receive kares. The end of that Mishnah lists one who neglects sacrificing the Pesach and one who does not undergo circumcision. These are positive mitzvahs, right? To eat the Pesach when the temple is standing, a Jew must partake of the Pesach. Unless he is Tameh, then he partakes of it a month later on Pesach Sheni. Or if he's too far away and it's impossible for him to get there, right? The Torah says that. But then he has Pesach Sheni. And Bris Milah, right? That a Jewish male must be circumcised. Now that's an obligation on his father, right? Because the baby obviously is not responsible for that. But once you're an adult, if for some reason, the situation was that you couldn't get circumcised and it's safe for you to do so, you don't have some kind of medical condition that prevents it, then it becomes your obligation, right? But that is a positive mitzvah, and if you don't do it, that's the two situations where kares applies. Usually kares only applies for one who intentionally violates a negative prohibition, thou shalt not. But bris, circumcision, and Pesach, the Passover offering, when the temple is standing, if you neglect those positive mitzvahs, the punishment is kares. So now Rav explains his difficulty. If Rabbi Avin is correct, derive that there is a prohibition against neglecting the sacrifice of the Pesach and not undergoing circumcision via kal vachomer inference from the case of one who leaves over sacrificial meat beyond the allotted period for its consumption. That's nosar, right? There's a period of time the sin offering can be eaten on the day that it's brought and that night. By the next day, even though there are edible portions of the sin offering available, it's forbidden to eat them. They need to be, disposed of, burned. And how do we learn out from nosar? Just as in the case of nosar, where the Torah did not prescribe punishment but nevertheless prohibited this act, so too with regard to neglecting the sacrifice of the Pesach and not undergoing circumcision, for which the Torah did prescribe punishment, kares, is it not logical that the Torah actually prohibited neglecting them as well? And Rav Ashi said, I stated this very discussion before Rav Kahana, and he said to me, one cannot derive a prohibition against neglecting the sacrifice of the Pesach from the case of nosar via kal vachomer inference, as it could be refuted. What is notable about one who leaves over sacrificial meat? He is notable in that there is no remedy once the prohibition has been violated. Shall you say the same about the neglect of the Pesach, for which there is a remedy? One who fails to bring it on the first Pesach may bring it on the second Pesach, Pesach Sheni, a month later. Again, this is when the temple is standing. Now, and if one who is, not having circumcision, there's a remedy, right? He can get the circumcision. The Gemara challenges the very premise of Rabbi Avin's claim. But one can derive that the Torah prohibits an action but can one derive that the Torah prohibits an action via kal v'chomer inference? Even the one who says that the court administers punishment based on a kal v'chomer inference concedes that one does not derive a prohibition from a kal v'chomer inference. Therefore, Rabbi Avin's claim is refuted. Rather, the prohibition against slaughtering an offering outside the temple courtyard can be derived not by kal v'chomer, not by finding it written. It's not written. So how do we derive it? It's derived in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, who says, it is derived from the prohibition against offering up outside the temple through a verbal analogy between the reference to bringing, stated with regard to slaughtering outside the temple, and the reference to bringing, stated with regard to offering up outside the temple. There's a common word in both verses where the punishment is stated, and therefore we're going to apply the prohibition that's connected explicitly to offering up outside the temple back to slaughtering outside the temple, where the punishment is slated explicitly, the prohibition isn't, but now we're going to be able to extend the prohibition through this verbal analogy. Now, with regard to slaughtering, it is stated, or that slaughters it outside the camp, and he did not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And with regard to offering up, it is stated that offers up a burnt offering or sacrifice, and he will not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. So the verbal analogy teaches that, just as there with regard to offering up, the Torah did not prescribe the punishment for an action unless it also explicitly prohibited the action, so too here, with regard to slaughtering, the Torah did not prescribe punishment unless it also prohibited it. Therefore, even though the Torah does not explicitly state the prohibition, it is evident that it is prohibited because these two things are so closely connected. Obviously, how are you going to offer up outside the temple if you didn't slaughter first? And presumably that slaughter happened outside the temple. I'm very close to done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And we're at the top of 107a. Rava said the prohibition can be derived in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Yonah. As Rabbi Yonah says, it is derived from the verse, but in the place that the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, there you shall offer up your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. That's Deuteronomy 12:14. And through the juxtaposition of the word there in the first part of the verse to the word there in the second part of the verse, this serves to juxtapose the offering up, mentioned in the first part, to the sacrifice of an offering, mentioned in the second part, which includes slaughtering it. Accordingly, it teaches that, just as there, with regard to offering up, the Torah did not prescribe punishment unless it also prohibited it, so too, here, with regard to slaughtering, the Torah did not prescribe punishment unless it also prohibited it. Therefore, even though the Torah does not explicitly state the prohibition, it is evident that slaughtering outside the temple for the purpose of offering is prohibited. That's what I've got for us tonight. A couple of comments. Sharon says that Sai, she didn't write this, but she's written it before, Sai, the Talmud cat, did not like the comment of cats being sacrificed. He literally got up and walked about 4 feet away. Cats can be pretty smart. And Karen says, Drasha agrees. Like, is Drasha the name of your cat? That's an awesome name. Ilanit, get well and stay well, everyone. Go and strain through the days of Teves 8, 9, and 10 that are coming in. We have a fast this week. Yes, we do. But because it's winter, the fast will be well over before I'm teaching the class at 6 o'clock. So I don't think we'll cancel the class that day. And it's a daytime fast, right? So the night before would not be affected. And that is on Tuesday. Tuesday is Asara B'Teves, the fast of Teves. That's this Tuesday. And then Sharon wrote later, Sai came back to the screen. You can't keep a Talmud cat away. I love it. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, see you tomorrow, Sunday at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night. Shavua Tov. Good vach. Have a good week.